All right, so this is chapter 9, getting closer and closer to the end here. We're only 5 chapters away, if you can believe it. So here we go. This is Democracy in America, and this chapter is pretty much all about one man, and that man is Andrew Jackson. So the book starts off with this event, which I think is really illuminating when starting to talk about Andrew Jackson. So on May 30th, 1806, a duel occurred. Yes, a duel, exactly like you're thinking. You have your dueling pistols, you walk your 10 paces, and you turn and fire. This was a thing. People actually did this. It was a problem in many countries. They tried to ban it in some places. It didn't work out well because if you felt you had been insulted in some way, you would challenge that man to a duel, and if that man refused to duel, then he had somehow tarnished his honor, and honor was really everything to people back then, and so you could not do that. So dueling was a problem, needless to say. Involved in that duel was a 39-year-old Andrew Jackson. This is, of course, before he became president. At the time, he was a Tennessee lawyer, and he was actually hit first. His opponent hit him in the chest, just shy of his heart, so it didn't kill him. He was obviously quite injured, but bleeding, he still fired back and managed to kill his opponent. This was not his first duel. It is one of many of the duels he fought in his very long and highly controversial career. But I feel like it's good that they included this in the introduction to your book because it really gives you kind of a snapshot of the kind of guy we're talking about here. Kind of guy who gets involved in a duel, one of many duels, and B, even though still shot and injured near his heart, manages to fire off a round and kill his opponent. So this tenacity, this toughness and vengefulness really characterizes Andrew Jackson's military and political career. And this mythology and symbolism becomes attached to who he is. You know, he's a man and he's a myth at the same time because of actions like this. And Jackson is going to become an enduring and very controversial symbol in America, and he remains controversial today for reasons that we shall see. Also, between the 1790s and the 1830s, the elites had to learn to listen, or at least pretend to listen, because sometimes that's what politicians do, to the multitude. So even though the elites at the time of the founding kind of scorned the multitudes as, people who should participate, but at a limited level, they are quickly learning that that's not going to cut it, and they have to at least pay lip service to their needs and their wants. So aside from the elite's fear of growing influence by the multitude, we're seeing a much more troubling pattern in national politics and culture emerging, and it's emerging at a regional level. We're seeing a shift toward what is called sectional conflict. Sectional, if that word confuses you, you could just substitute regional. It's a regional conflict among different parts of the United States, mainly north and south, but also the West. And of course, the West at this time isn't the West like the West Coast the way we think of it, because of course we don't have California yet. So we're mainly talking about the areas between, the West is the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, though we do know that we gained all that land west of the Mississippi River with the Louisiana Purchase. So that is coming into play as well here too. Since 1789, the state of Virginia had wielded more influence on the federal government than any other state. I mean, just think about it. 4 of our first 5 presidents were from Virginia, just to give you an idea of how much power it had. It was the first British colony, and it certainly started off in our history as the most powerful one. However, things are changing. The market revolution had caused the country's population to start growing faster in northern states. So even though Virginia had been extremely powerful due to the fact that it was a very populous state and a very large state, that's changing as northern states are now growing in population more because they are being supplemented by migrants from other parts of the country who are seeking work in the factories we talked about in the last chapter, and also immigrants, which we also talked about in the last chapter. And so northern political leaders are growing wary of the disproportionate influence that Virginia and other southern states had. And they feared that, Okay, the southern states are distinct in their own ways, but at the same time, they share a common interest in that they want to protect slavery. And they fear that that made them a powerful voting bloc. And no, that's not a typo. That's how, when you're saying voting bloc, that's how you spell bloc. Meaning that they're going to come together and they're going to team up and they're going to vote certain ways simply because they want to make sure that they're going to perpetuate the institution of slavery. So the North and the South begin to clash over federal policy as the North gradually ends slavery and the South is coming to depend more on slavery more than ever. And the North is going to be very critical of the South's dependence on slavery as they, are kind of sitting up there on their high horse like, well, we're emancipating our slaves. But recall from last chapter that they are not exactly free from the taint of slavery here. They are profiting very much from slavery because the cotton from the South is powering the market revolution that's largely taking place in the North. These rising tensions are going to erupt in the Missouri crisis. So Missouri was a territory, of course, and they applied for statehood in 1819. However, at the time, there was an even number of slave and free states. There were 11 free and 11 slaves. So the Senate was evenly balanced. So those interests there were split down the middle. However, the House of Representatives was dominated by the North. Remember that the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is determined by population. And recall that the North's population is growing faster than the South at this time. So the North had 105 representatives versus the South at 81 representatives. So the Northern-controlled House passed the Tallmadge Amendment, designed to further prohibit the introduction of slaves to Missouri. And then it called for the gradual emancipation of slaves already in that territory because there's going to be a question that's going to come up as to whether or not a territory can allow slavery or can prevent slavery. And this is going to be a question that they don't answer. It is an unanswered question. And so before Missouri becomes a state, there are slaves living there. And so the question is, well, what do we do about it? Is it going to be a slave state or is it going to be a free state? And what do we do about the slaves already living there? Well, this amendment called for a halt to any further introduction of slaves and the emancipation of the slaves already living there. Unsurprisingly, it was defeated in the Senate, which ignited this sectional debate again of the slave-holding South and the free, gradually becoming free North. Again, also unsurprisingly, the Southerners believed that the Tallmadge Amendment threatened the future of the plantation system. And they also believed that it implied a moral attack on slavery and the Southern way of life. Because recall we mentioned in the last chapter, a majority of whites in the South do not own slaves. That's kind of become the common belief for some reason, but owning slaves was extremely expensive. So most people, A, didn't own slaves because they couldn't afford it, and B, those that didn't actually own vast majority of them. So the plantation owners who, have these large scale plantations with, 150 or more slaves, those were very rare. But even if you only owned a few slaves, or even if you didn't own any slaves, you still saw slavery as this Southern way of life. Racial hierarchy was seen as a Southern way of life. So even those that didn't own slaves would have been offended by this amendment. So House Speaker Henry Clay proposed a compromise. He's going to do this a lot, as you'll see. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, whereas Maine would be admitted to the Union as a free state because Maine was still a territory at this part as well. Despite being on the East Coast, it was not part of the 13 original colonies. And then they decided that slavery would be prohibited in the remaining portions of the Louisiana Purchase north of the latitude 3630. And you can see that line over there on the map to the right, that dark black line would be no slaves allowed in any of that territory north. The gray territory, that is territory that we yet do not own as the United States. And when we do acquire that territory, there's going to be issues, as you can imagine, with the expansion of slavery. So the Missouri Compromise will temporarily diffuse the political crisis over slavery. However, it is going to heavily foreshadow the divisive debates over the expansion of slavery. And this is going to resurface in the 1840s and the 1850s for reasons we just mentioned. We are going to acquire through war pretty much all of that territory in the gray that you see, and we will become pretty much the continental United States. And the question is going to resurface again. I mean, as Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. So if we're going to keep adding states, do we have to add a free and a slave state every time? How is this going to work? It worked this time, but it's not a compromise that is going to be sustainable, as we shall see. And to give you an idea of this issue of slavery, Thomas Jefferson recalled and made this prediction long before this. This momentous question, i.e. slavery, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. So here he was accurately predicting that this was going to be an issue which would seriously divide the nation, as we know that. All right, so bringing Andrew Jackson into the picture again. Andrew Jackson's rise really exemplified both the opportunities and the dangers of political life in the early republic. He was a man who did lots of different things. He was a lawyer, he was a slaveholder, he was a general, and of course the 7th president of the United States. And being able to achieve all of those things is pretty surprising when you consider that he rose from very humble beginnings. This is a true rags to riches story. He was born March 15th, 1767, on the border between North and South Carolina to immigrant parents from Northern Ireland. So again, it's rare that we see this in the case of politicians at the highest level, people who truly come from nothing and achieve this success, but he was one of them. At age 13, he joined the American militia in the Revolutionary War. They didn't really have, obviously, very stringent age requirements in terms of war at that time. You could lie or you could just join, and they really weren't too persnickety about it. So yeah, he was 13 when he had joined the militia. He was eventually captured by the British. And there's another famous story that's kind of become almost mythical in legend surrounding him, that a British officer slashed his head with a sword when he refused to shine the officer's shoes. So again, it's another example of the kind of character of the man we're dealing with. He's not the kind of guy who takes well to authority. Disease and war killed 2 of his brothers and his mother, and this left him with a continual hatred of the country of Great Britain. After the war, he moved to Tennessee. He became a lawyer, again, despite not having the best start in life and not having a good education, and over time was able to become successful enough to acquire land and slaves. And eventually he had 150 slaves at the Hermitage, which is the name of his plantation that he had near Nashville. So again, recall that majority of people in the South can't own slaves. Those that do don't own them in large numbers. So the fact that he had 150 slaves at the Hermitage shows that he was a man of some substance economically. In 1796, he was elected as a U.S. representative, and in 1797, he was elected briefly as a senator, though he does resign, citing economic issues. Eventually, he obtained a general's commission at the outbreak of the War of 1812. We know he did fight at a very young age in the Revolution, but it's not like he's a trained military professional. He was in the militia. But despite that, he's able to use his political connections to become a general, and he really impressed his troops, who nicknamed him Old Hickory. He won a major victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, and his most famous victory would be his 1815 defeat of the British invasion force at the Battle of New Orleans, which actually occurred after the War of 1812 had already ended, but due to slow communication, neither side knew that, and it was still a big victory for the United States, and specifically Andrew Jackson. It made him a national hero. In 1816, Jackson was given vague orders by the United States government to break Seminole resistance in Florida. So the Seminoles were a Native American tribe in Florida, which then was not part of the United States, and they continually caused issues for the United States. They liked to help runaway slaves, which of course angered whites in the South. They would do a lot of attacks over the border, etc. So he had these vague orders to kind of deal with the Seminoles. And under those orders, he decided to invade a British fort that was built on Spanish soil. And he killed 270 formerly enslaved people there and executed some survivors. And then he did it again in 1818. He crosses the border again, occupied Pensacola, Florida, and arrested 2 British subjects and executed them on the pretext that they were helping the Seminoles. And again, he's got this vague order from the government to deal with the Seminoles. So that was his excuse for executing these British citizens. Well, not surprising, his execution of 2 British citizens on pretty shaky grounds caused an international diplomatic crisis. The British are not happy about that. And at the time, the president was President Monroe. And he and his officials were pretty angry, and they wanted to call for an official censure of his actions. However, his very clever Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, the son of the former president and founding father John Adams, saw his actions as very useful. He used Jackson's military successes to effectively persuade Spain to sign the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, which actually gave the United States Florida. So at this point, again, Jackson is a hero. He's had a number of military successes, even though his behavior in Florida is questionable at best. People agree with his actions, and they really support him. And so he has a pretty strong political base. At the same time, the decline of the Federalist Party left the Republican Party unchallenged. There were no other political parties at the time. In February of 1824, a small group of Republicans attended a caucus and decided to elect William Crawford of Georgia as their presidential nominee. However, a lot of people saw this as very elitist. Like this small group of people get together and say, this guy's going to be our nominee for president. And because there's no other political party, he's going to be running on, nobody's going to be running against him. He's running unchallenged. That's not fair. So these critics decide to challenge the caucus as elitist and undemocratic, and the Tennessee state legislature then nominates Andrew Jackson as president. Kentucky then throws its hat in the ring and nominates Henry Clay, and the New England Republicans nominate John Quincy Adams. So you now have all these people running under one party ticket for president. Jackson did receive more of the popular and electoral votes than his three rivals. However, he did not win the majority needed for electoral votes to be considered president. And so when that happens, the election goes to the House of Representatives, and they decide who gets to be president. So the Speaker of the House was actually Henry Clay, who, remember, had been nominated himself to run for president. And he was out of the race at this point. But he now found himself as Speaker of the House in a powerful position to choose the next president. Because he's the Speaker of the House, he has a lot of influence in who the House votes for. And he despised Jackson, just utterly and absolutely. He didn't know John Quincy Adams well. It's not like they were friends, but they did have very politically similar views. So he decides to back John Quincy Adams, and his influence on the House prevails, and John Quincy Adams wins the presidency, one of two father-son duos to serve as president, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and of course both George Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. In return for helping get him nominated as president, John Quincy Adams, pictured there to the right, then named Henry Clay Secretary of State. That doesn't look so good, huh? So Jackson and his supporters accused Clay and Adams then of dealing in a corrupt bargain, basically saying, you agreed to back John Quincy Adams because John Quincy Adams agreed to make you Secretary of State. And again, that really doesn't look so good. And the deal actually really tarnishes the entire presidency of John Quincy Adams, which really honestly is a shame because John Quincy Adams was very intellectually brilliant, just a brilliant intellectual mind. He didn't, however, have a personal charm. Like, he didn't exude the common touch the way that somebody like Andrew Jackson did. So that really didn't help out his cause. And that seems to be the case with a lot of very intelligent people. They don't come off well sometimes in social situations, maybe because of their high intelligence. I don't really know. But it's unfortunate for him because he really was a strong political figure and a very brilliant political mind. And he only served one term because his bargain with Henry Clay really sullied his reputation and energized Jackson's supporters. So whereas he's seen as this, corrupt elitist politician, Jackson is hailed as a military hero and a champion of the people. And in the next presidential election, he easily defeated John Quincy Adams. And his election marks a new era in American political history. He again is hailed as this hero of the common man. And he vowed to include the voice of the people in the election process. And under his presidency, the Jacksonians dramatically expanded suffrage to virtually all white men. Because remember, prior to this, states were allowed to determine who could and could not vote. and many times it was limited to owning white men only. Jackson himself is a self-made soldier, politician, and planter, and because of that, he believed the average American could quickly master most government jobs. You didn't have to have, a fancy upbringing or background to be able to serve in the government. And he supported what he called a spoils system, in which he rewarded loyal party workers with government jobs. Because again, the question for him, it wasn't so much about ability so as loyalty to him. It didn't matter, your background or your education or your experience so much as you have to be loyal to Andrew Jackson. And if that's the case, then you can serve in his government. He's also the first president from the West. So again, in this, we mean the lands to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. And he shared those frontiers' distrust of the Eastern elite. And he promised to represent the interests from the common majority by attacking the perceived special privileges in American life. So the first major controversy of his presidency involves what came to be known as the Tariff of Abomination. So tariffs are designed to raise revenue and protect American industry from European competitors. You remember, in their most basic form, they're essentially taxes on foreign goods. And the idea is to make the foreign goods more expensive. So A, we get the tax revenue, and B, people will prefer to buy American goods, and that will help American industry. So in 1828, Congress passed a very high protective tariff for the United States. And a lot of people opposed this. Led by South Carolina, most of the southern states were strongly against it. And they called the law the Tariff of Abominations because they just hated it so much. And they argued that the industrial North will flourish because of this, because again, tariffs help industry. But the South will, on the other hand, have to sell their cotton in a world market unprotected by tariffs. So why does the North get special privileges that we don't get? Why do they get protective tariffs where we don't have protective tariffs? And they, in return, have to buy manufactured goods at high prices because of this tariff. And so in their mind, it's a lose-lose situation. In 1828, the vice president at the time, the man pictured over there on the right, quite possibly one of the most frightening-looking men in all of history, John C. Calhoun, anonymously wrote a pamphlet called South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he denounced the tariff. He argued that the Union, meaning the United States, the Union of States, was a compact formed by sovereign states. He believed that that a state could declare a federal law null and void, meaning if the federal government passes a law that a state decides has exceeded the delegated powers of Congress, such as this tariff, they can say, nah, we're not going to follow it within their own boundaries. So if South Carolina says, nope, this tariff, we're not going to enforce it, we're not going to follow it, then South Carolina can do that. And this is called the Doctrine of Nullification. And in it, he's using the same states' rights argument formulated by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now, he's not advocating secession. He's not advocating that South Carolina and the other southern states break away and form their own union. In fact, he believed that nullification would help to prevent disunion because it would basically give the states carte blanche when it comes to federal laws. If they pass a federal law and you don't like it, you can say, nah, we're good. We're not going to follow that. So obviously, this is a very controversial idea. In January of 1830, Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina defended states' rights and the doctrine of nullification. And he gave a speech in the Senate in which he attracted a lot of national attention for this argument. This triggered a major debate with a senator from the North, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, who at the time was widely regarded as our nation's greatest orator. He stated that the Constitution was created by the people, not the states, and that the Supreme Court, not the states, can decide the constitutionality of the law. However, South Carolina refuses to back down, and the state legislature decided to adopt an ordinance of nullification concerning the tariff. And Jackson denounces this from the perspective of people on the other side. This is a dangerous situation. What good is the federal government then? If the federal government passes laws and the states decide, no, we don't like it, they can just argue that's not in your power and just not follow it. So what's the point of having the federal government then? And he actually asked Congress for a force bill, which would authorize him to use the Army to forcibly influence federal laws in South Carolina. And tensions are mounting. I mean, we are getting very dangerously close to a civil war here before the actual Civil War. And things get pretty bad until Henry Clay again decides to propose another compromise. As I said, he does this a lot. The compromise tariff would gradually reduce the tariff over a period of 10 years. The compromise works, crisis avoided. The second major controversy of Andrew Jackson's presidency is going to be the Indian Removal Act, and it's probably the one most well known. So at the time, there were 125,000 Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River. And by this point in time, they're well and truly surrounded by white settlers on all sides and further encroaching on their lands. And the United States government wanted these tribes to be resettled across the Mississippi to free up their tribal lands for white settlers. And so in order to do this, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, in which the government proposed an exchange of Indian lands in the east for government lands in the west in the newly established Indian Territory. Well, one group of Native Americans decided to fight this and legally challenge the removal order, and that's the Cherokees. And in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall actually upheld the Cherokees Nation's right to land. And he argued, look, throughout our history, we have signed treaties with the Native Americans, meaning we view the Native Americans as a separate nation, and we have no authority to rid another nation of their lands. We can't take away we don't have that ability, we don't have that sovereignty over their lands. And so he said the Cherokees get to keep their lands. Now it's the job of the president to enforce Supreme Court decisions and acts of Congress. That's what the executive branch does. Executive branch enforces these decisions. So the problem is, even though John Marshall says, yes, the Cherokees have a right to their land, they can't be forced to move, Jackson says, yeah, I'm not going to enforce that. He was pretty famous as they called it at the time, an Indian fighter. Remember his wars against the Seminoles. And he had a pretty well-known dislike of the Native Americans. So he says, I'm not going to enforce this decision. And he doesn't. In fact, he defies the court's decision. In 1838, the United States Army forcibly removed 17,000 Cherokees from their ancestral lands, as well as you can see from this map, other Native American groups. So all the Native American groups living east of the Mississippi River, as you can see here, are moved west of the Mississippi River to that Indian Territory, as it was called over there in the dark orange. The Cherokees had to make an 800-mile journey to their portion of Indian Territory, and on the way, a quarter of the Cherokees died from diseases and exhaustion. And as a result, this forcible removal has been known as the Trail of Tears. The third controversy of Andrew Jackson's career is the Bank War. So the 20-year charter of the Second Bank of the United States was scheduled to expire in 1836. Jackson, however, viewed the bank as a monster. Again, he's from the West. He's a frontier guy. He felt that the bank concentrated special financial privileges in the hands of elites. Remember, he's all about attacking these so-called elites as he sees them. And so in July of 1832, he vetoed a bill to recharter the bank. Now, without the bank's freestanding policies, state-chartered banks started to expand credit to people who weren't able to pay back their loans, which is a huge problem. They also started flooding the country with paper currency, which is another problem because that causes inflation. Supply and demand, the more there is of something, the less valuable it comes. So when you print out a bunch of money, it devalues that money. And it also promoted widespread speculation of Western lands and transportation projects, and it contributed to the financial panic of 1837, which led to a lengthy economic slump. So Andrew Jackson, as you can see, is a very polarizing figure. The South Carolina nullification crisis, the Indian Removal Act, the National Bank, these are all divisive issues. And because of that, some of his political opponents, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, just hated him personally and politically. And so they decided to leave the Democrat-Republicans and form a new political party, the Whig Party with an H. The Whigs favored protective tariffs, internal improvements, roads, bridges, canals, railroad, etc., a renewed national bank, and they were united by their extreme dislike of Andrew Jackson and his chosen successor, Martin Van Buren. So after he served his 2 terms, he personally designated and let it be known that this man, Martin Van Buren, had his support to become the next president. So in 1840, the Whigs nominated a man named William Henry Harrison to oppose Van Buren. And they emphasized the fact that Harrison had a heroic military victory over Native Americans himself. And they blamed Van Buren, who they, I guess, cleverly called Van Ruin, for the economic slump, which really was caused by Jackson and his refusal to recharter the bank, though, again, Van Buren is very much in the same camp as Jackson in that sense. Harrison actually wins, and this is a huge turning point in the new Democratic style of running political campaigns. So even though Harrison himself was not like an everyday man the way Andrew Jackson was, he was actually the son of a very prominent Virginia planter who also signed the Declaration of Independence, so he's definitely part of the elite group. But even though he himself is part of this elite group of individuals, his campaign depicted him as like the everyman. And they call it the log cabin and hard cider campaign. You can see from this political cartoon on the right there. Those were their symbols for their campaign, the log cabin and hard cider, which were things that, you know, frontier average people would have. They'd live in a log cabin and they would drink hard cider. And so it was a way of making him look like he was one of them, even though he's really not, and helped him to campaign with the common man. And so historians consider, as they call it, the log cabin and hard cider the first modern election, because both parties are actively campaigning among the voting masses, trying to make that appeal that they're just like them in the same way that politicians do to this day. So to conclude, the Whigs and the Democrats had sharply contrasting views on everything. The tariffs, internal improvements, the national bank, Indian removal, and both parties had spread across a broad geographic region. They included a variety of social classes, and they endorsed increased political participation of the common man. And so that is where we will end chapter. Our chapter question. The Obama administration proposed replacing Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. The Trump administration has delayed this replacement. Do you agree with the decision of the Obama administration to remove Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill? Why or why not?